For 12,000 years, one family controlled the flow of knowledge across an entire civilization, trained every maester in every castle, hosted the religion that governed the souls of millions, and quietly accumulated a wealth that dwarfed even the gold of Casterly Rock. They did all of this without ever once claiming a crown. That is the story we are entering tonight. So let yourself arrive here slowly. Let the weight of the day behind you release from your shoulders, one muscle at a time. Let your breathing find a pace that belongs to it without effort. You do not need to hold on to anything right now. The history of House Hightower is not a story built for hurrying through. It is built the way a tower is built, stone upon stone, layer upon layer, across an almost unimaginable depth of years. We're going back a very long way tonight. Let yourself drift backward into the oldest silence you have ever been allowed to inhabit. The place we're travelling to is called Battle Isle, a low rocky elevation at the mouth of the Honeywine River, where the river finally surrenders itself to the Whispering Sound. The Whispering Sound is not named for drama. It is named for the particular quality of wind that moves across its water, low and conversational, never quite loud enough to make out what it is saying. The gulls that circle above the harbour mouth here are the quiet kind, the ones that glide more than they call. Even the tides have a certain unhurried quality in this corner of the world, as though the geography itself understood something about patience that the rest of Westeros has never quite managed to learn. At the centre of this island there stands a tower. It is among the oldest structures in the Western world, and whoever built its base never left so much as a name behind. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. The base of the Hightower is not made of stone you can find in any known quarry. It is black, dense, smooth, in a way that ordinary stone rarely achieves. Smooth in the manner of something shaped by a process or a tool that the current world does not possess or remember. Maesters at the Citadel, who maintain access to stone samples from every corner of the known world, have compared this material to everything available to them. They have set it alongside volcanic basalt from the Dragonmont, against carved obsidian from Valyrian ruins, against foundation stones recovered from ancient coastal sites on the shores of the Jade Sea. Nothing matches. The material is genuinely, stubbornly, unexplainably unique against everything that scholars know how to name or quarry. And the only thing stranger than the stone itself is the fact that it appears in several other locations scattered across the world, as if whatever made the Hightower's base did not stop at the mouth of the Honeywine. The seastone chair of the Iron Island is carved from this same material, a throne shaped like a kraken, worn smooth by uncountable generations of iron-born kings, its origins as mysterious as the grey sea that surrounds its home. Far to the east, in the shadow city that huddles against the walls of ancient Ashai, ruins of this same black stone have been found worked into foundations and archways, remnants of something that preceded the shadow city by an era no living historian can calculate. Beneath the ancient structure underlying the city of Lorath in Essos, the same material surfaces again in the bedrock. Whatever civilization produced this stone moved across a world far larger than any empire or kingdom we have a name for. It moved at a time so distant that the oldest legends of the oldest peoples alive today do not reach back far enough to find it. This is where the history of House Hightower actually begins, not with a family. With a material that predates the concept of family entirely. When the first men crossed the land bridge from Essos into Westeros some 12,000 years before the reign of Aegon the Conqueror, they arrived in a continent that was already inhabited and in certain places already marked by structures they could not explain. The children of the forest had occupied this land for longer than first men memory could reach, tending their sacred groves, singing through the weirwoods in their strange tree song, moving through forests that stretched unbroken across most of the continent. But the children had not built the Blackstone ruin on Battle Isle. It was there when they arrived. They did not speak of it in any record that survives. It stood at the mouth of the Honeywine like a question that had decided to become a landmark, not demanding an answer, simply present, simply there, simply older than anything the newly arrived first men carried a word for in their language. Somewhere among those earliest, most sparsely recorded settlements on the shores of the Whispering Sound, a family climbed the Blackstone ruin and decided it was useful. We do not know their name in its original form. The histories simply do not carry memory back that far. Perhaps it was a pragmatic man who noticed the height offered an unobstructed view of the harbour approach and the open water beyond. Perhaps it was a family driven by superstition, who felt that something so anomalous must be sacred, and that living near it would bring the protection of whatever power had set it there. Or perhaps, and this is the most human explanation, it was simply a family without a home who found a solid structure and decided to stay. Whatever the reason, they stayed. They built on top of the mystery rather than around it, and in doing so they began a dynasty that would outlast every other in the Western world. It is worth pausing on that thought for a moment rather than hurrying past it. We speak so easily about ancient things, ancient families, ancient towers, ancient cities, without quite letting ourselves feel the full weight of what the word is trying to carry. 12,000 years is not ancient the way a 100-year-old farmhouse is ancient. It is ancient the way the ocean floor is deep, not conceptually deep, but experientially, irreducibly deep, the kind of depth you cannot measure from the inside. The first men who first climbed that black stone ruin were as distant from the Hightower of the Dance of Dragons as Alicent herself is from us today. The family that watched the Targaryen conquest from the top of their tower could look backward at their own origins and find nothing but silence, the same blank silence we encounter when we try to find them. Time, at this scale, is not a corridor. It is an ocean, and we are only ever standing at its edge. The name came later, as names always do. In the beginning there was only the place, the rock, the water, the cold wind off the sound, the fire at the top of the structure, and the people who maintained all of these things. By the time the peoples of this coast had developed a common tongue stable enough to write things down, the family on Battle Isle had been there long enough that the name of the tower and the name of the family had blurred together into something inseparable. You were a Hightower because you came from the High Tower. The High Tower was worth noticing precisely because the Hightowers kept its fire burning and called it home across unbroken generations. Architecture and identity had merged so completely that it was no longer possible to say which had produced which, and perhaps that was from the very beginning exactly the point. Their words are "We light the way." Of all the mottos that the great houses of Westeros have chosen to put on their banners, words about winter and lions and fire and blood and iron and stone, the High Tower motto is remarkable for what it does not claim. It does not say "we rule," it does not say "we conquer," it does not even say "we endure," though endurance is in fact what House Hightower has done better than almost any other family in the recorded history of the continent. What the words say is something more modest, and at the same time more indispensable. They provide a light, they illuminate, they make it possible for other people to navigate dangerous waters without requiring those people to kneel or acknowledge the transaction. The light is simply there, the harbour is simply accessible, and the family that maintains the fire asks very little in return, only that you know, somewhere quietly, that the light is theirs. The High Tower itself, as it stands in the Age of the Main series, is approximately 500 feet tall. That number lands in the mind cleanly, and then immediately exceeds the imagination's ability to fully inhabit it, so let yourself think instead about the sensation of it. 500 feet is a building whose upper floors dissolve into cloud on overcast mornings. It is a building whose shadow, in the long slant of late afternoon, sweeps across the lower city at a pace just slow enough to track if you stand still and watch it. The tower has been added to by so many generations of high towers that it has the geological quality of a cliff face, lighter limestone at the upper stories, darker sandstone in the middle sections, and at the very base below everything the family has ever built, that smooth and nameless black stone sitting in the earth like a word in a language no one has spoken for 10,000 years. At the summit, the beacon burns. It burns in white on ordinary nights, a steady warm pulse visible from 20 miles out on the open water, one fixed point in an otherwise shifting darkness. On other nights, for other signals, it burns in different colours that the pilots and navigators of the Whispering Sound have memorised across generations, in the way that coastal people memorise anything that keeps ships from running aground. There is a smell to the beacon fire that clings to the harbour district, something between heated pine resin and iron, a quality of combustion that has soaked into the cobblestones and the harbour front masonry across the accumulated nights of 12,000 years. Children who grow up in Oldtown have this smell catalogued in the back of their minds, simply as the smell of home. It is only visitors, arriving by ship from somewhere else, who pause at the dock and lift their heads and wonder what that particular scent is. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. When Samwell Tarly arrived in Oldtown in the years following the death of the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, he came by ship up the Whispering Sound from the south, and the Hightower was the first thing he distinguished through the morning haze. The beacon burning white at its summit, high above everything, visible long before the city itself resolved out of the mist. Sam was not, by disposition, a man given to dramatic responses to visual information. He was a reader, a cataloguer, a man who preferred the inside of a library to any horizon the world might offer. But standing at the ship's railing in borrowed clothes, with everything he had survived pressing on him from behind, he felt the age of what he was looking at in a way that no book had prepared him for. He had read about the Hightower. He knew its dimensions and its geological anomalies and its history. And yet the tower exceeded its own description in the way that only the very oldest and most real things can. In the world of the main series, the Hightower exists as a kind of silent counterweight to the Iron Throne, the older power against the newer one, the deep root against the recent grafting. King's Landing is a city barely 300 years old, built in a hurry on an unremarkable stretch of land that nobody had particularly wanted before Aegon the Conqueror decided it would make a useful capital. Oldtown is 40 times that age, at minimum. Its streets carry the memory of every civilization that has touched Westeros across 12,000 years. First men and Andal merchants and Valyrian traders, and scholars from the distant east and sailors from the Summer Islands. When Daenerys Targaryen contemplates the dynasty she believes she was born to restore, she's contemplating a political arrangement that the Hightowers watched come into existence and have been quietly managing ever since. The Targaryens built a throne. The Hightowers built something that existed before anyone thought to build a throne. Let yourself drift back from the tower now. Let the image of the beacon, steady, white, enduring, settle somewhere behind your closed eyes and breathe slowly. You are resting. The history of House Hightower has 12,000 years of patience in it, and it will wait for you while you sleep. The black stone at the base of the tower does not know what century this is. The fire at the top does not distinguish between the sleeping and the wakeful among those who look up at it from the water. It simply burns. It simply guides. Let your breathing become as slow and as patient as the oldest stone you have ever been asked to imagine. There is nothing you need to hold on to in this hour. The tower stands, the harbour is open, the light is yours to navigate by, if you ever need it. But for now, you need nothing. For now, your watch is ended. But the tower was only the foundation. The Hightowers were building something else alongside it, stone by invisible stone, across the centuries, an institution that would give them reach into every castle and every court in Westeros. Not a garrison, not an army. Something far more difficult to defend against. A school. We drift deeper into Oldtown now, but not to the tower. We drift instead to the city that grew up around it. The streets that spread outward from Battle Isle like the rings of water from a stone cast into still water. Each generation building a little further from the original foundation, each century adding new layers to what was already, by almost any measure, the most complex human settlement in the Western world. The air in Oldtown has a quality that visitors always remark upon. It smells of paper and river water and the faint herbaceous residue of 1,000 years of alchemical work, done behind closed doors in tall stone buildings. It smells, people say, of thinking. That might be fanciful. But every city does develop an atmosphere that reflects its primary activity, and Oldtown's primary activity, for as long as any record can establish, has been the accumulation and patient organisation of knowledge. Let yourself settle into that. Let your thoughts soften at the edges. The Honeywine flows through Oldtown from north to south, a river narrower than the Trident but deep enough at its mouth to accommodate the largest trading vessels in the known world. The city spreads across both banks and several islands, connected by bridges in various states of antiquity. Some of dressed limestone, some of a darker and older material, whose origin the inhabitants stopped questioning generations ago. The wharves are perpetually busy in the way of cities whose commerce never entirely sleeps. Merchant galleys from the Summer Islands sit alongside local fishing ketches, and associate trade vessels unload alongside pilgrim ships bringing the faithful north to the Starry Sept. Oldtown does not privilege one type of trade above another, or one people above another. Its power has always come from being the place where things converge, ships and scholars and goods and ideas arriving from every direction, depositing something of themselves before moving on. At the southern end of the city, where the river turns east and the ground rises slightly above the floodplain, the Citadel stands. It is not a single building, but a complex, a collection of towers and halls and libraries and herbaries and workyards that has accumulated across centuries and now covers more ground than a small town. The Citadel is the greatest centre of learning in the known world. Within its walls, young men who intend to spend their lives serving the great houses of Westeros are trained in healing, history, astronomy, agriculture, economics, engineering, and the management of the ravens that carry messages between castles across the entire continent. The Conclave, the inner council of senior maesters, governs the institution and also determines placement throughout the realm. Every castle of significance in Westeros has a maester. Every maester those castles have ever had was trained at the Citadel. Every one of those men was shaped, in some fundamental way, by this institution, in this city, in the long shadow of the Hightower. Consider the ravens. In a world without a postal service, without reliable roads, without any system for moving information from one end of the continent to the other, in less than weeks of horseback travel, the raven is everything. A lord in the north learns of events in the south within hours or days of those events occurring, via a bird that covered in flight what would take a rider many weeks on the ground. Every raven in Westeros that carries a message between castles was raised and trained at the Citadel. Every raven was bonded to its destination and its paired location, its nature understood, its care and feeding managed by a maester who knew how to read what it brought and how to send it back. The entire information network of Westeros, the nervous system of the realm, runs through Oldtown, through the Citadel, through the institution whose buildings stand on Hightower patronised land. It is worth sitting with what that actually means before we move past it. The Hightowers did not found the Citadel. They did not write its charter, or establish its traditions, or direct its curriculum. The Citadel, like the Hightower itself, appears in the historical record almost fully formed, a thing that exists rather than a thing that was made. But the Citadel exists on the banks of the Honeywine. It functions within the city of Oldtown. Its scholars walk streets where Hightower authority maintains order, trade in markets where Hightower customs apply, and pray in septs that Hightower patronage has maintained for generations. You can possess the institution without formally owning the institution. You simply have to own the ground it stands on. You have to be the family that lights the way, and let the institution that depends on that light know, quietly, who holds the torch. Think about what a Lord's Maester actually does in the daily life of a Westerosi castle. He is the Lord's physician, attending to illness and injury. He is the Lord's tutor, educating children who will one day rule in his place. He is the Lord's secretary, reading and writing letters for a lord who may not himself be literate. He is the Lord's astronomical calendar, tracking dates and seasons and the movements of the stars that govern the planting of crops and the timing of military campaigns. He manages the ravens. He advises on matters of law and custom. He is, in short, the single most functionally important person in the daily operation of any castle that has one, and every single one of these men who sit at the right hand of every lord in the Seven Kingdoms, learned everything they know within walking distance of the beacon that the Hightowers have kept burning for 12,000 years. There is something else worth considering here, something that requires sitting quietly with the long view. The maesters who educate the children of the nobility are shaping the next generation of lords and ladies before those lords and ladies have any framework with which to evaluate what they are being taught. A child of 8 who is told by his maester that certain things are true, about the nature of history, about what is possible, about magic and medicine and the structure of the world, will carry those convictions into adulthood with the certainty of things learned early. The maester is not the parent, but in many households he is the most consistent teacher. In some households, where the lord is frequently away at war or at court, the maester may be the most present adult in the young lord's life across his most formative years. The cumulative effect of this, across centuries and across every noble household in the realm, is something larger than any one man arranged. We should sit with that idea for a moment before moving on, because what we are describing is something genuinely difficult to see from inside it. Every generation of Westerosi nobility was educated, in part, by men who came from the same institution, in the same city, shaped by the same curriculum with the same set of assumptions about what the world is and how it works. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. Most of the maesters who shaped those children believed entirely in what they were teaching. Most of them had good intentions and genuine care for the families they served. But when a single institution shapes the intellectual formation of an entire ruling class across centuries, it does not need to intend anything particular in order to have particular effects. It simply needs to remain consistent, and consistency, as any master could tell you, is the one thing that the Citadel has never failed to provide. Oldtown at night is a different city than Oldtown at midday. During the day it is commercial and purposeful and alive with the multilingual murmur of a trading city where several languages compete for space in every conversation. But at night, when the market stalls have been shuttered and the last scholars have retreated to their cells and the streets have quieted to a level below conversation, the city shows its other face. The cobblestones, worn smooth by uncountable generations of passing feet, reflect the light of the street torches in a way that makes the city look slightly submerged, as though you are moving through something rather than across it. The Hightowers beacon pulses softly at the edge of every rooftop view. The smell of the river strengthens after dark, mixing with the particular library dust of the Citadel, and the residue of the harbour fires into something that is uniquely, irreducibly this place. Inside the Citadel at night, lights still burn in the upper windows. The studies of the archmaesters, the reading rooms where novices stay too late over scrolls they are not yet supposed to understand. The ravens in their mews murmur the way ravens do when they are not quite asleep, shifting on their perches, occasionally releasing a black feather that drifts to the floor of the cage without any urgency. The libraries, which are the largest collection of written knowledge in the Western world by an order of magnitude, are dark but not empty feeling, the air in them still slightly alive with the exhalations of old paper, the slow breathing of vellum and parchment in their careful stacks. Somewhere in those stacks, on a shelf that has not been disturbed in decades, there may be a scroll that explains what the black stone at the base of the Hightower actually is. If such a scroll exists, it is waiting patiently for the right reader to arrive. The relationship between the Hightower family and the Citadel is not one of direct control. The Hightowers do not appoint the archmaesters. They do not approve the curriculum. They do not have a seat on the conclave. The relationship is older and subtler than any of that. The relationship of a city to the great institution it grew around. The relationship of a patron family to the tradition that gives its home its significance. The Hightowers need the Citadel to be what it is, because without it Oldtown is merely a large port city. Distinguished, but not irreplaceable. The Citadel needs the Hightowers to be what they are, because without their continuous patronage and governance of the city, the institution would have to rebuild elsewhere, disrupting centuries of accumulated record and tradition. They sustain each other in the way that roots and soil sustain each other, each making the other possible without either one being exactly in charge. In the centuries before the Targaryen conquest, Oldtown was the administrative and commercial heart of the continent. Merchants from Essos who wanted access to Westerosi markets came to Oldtown first, not because the Hightowers required it, but because the infrastructure made it the most efficient point of entry. Trade agreements negotiated in Oldtown had a way of holding, partly because the legal traditions were older and the record-keeping more precise, and partly because everyone understood that the Citadel's archives would preserve the terms of any agreement made there. The maesters did not take sides in commercial disputes. They simply recorded things accurately and kept those records in a building unlikely to burn. This combination of institutional reliability and accumulated record made Oldtown the place where serious business was conducted, and the Hightowers the family that presided, quietly and without being asked to, over the conditions that made serious business possible. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. When Samwell Tarly arrived at the Citadel in the years of the main series, he carried with him something the institution had not held in its records for decades: first-hand testimony from beyond the wall. He had seen the White Walkers. He had fought one with dragonglass. He had been present at the massacre at the Fist of the First Men. He arrived at the greatest repository of knowledge in the known world, carrying information that the realm needed desperately, and he found an institution so accustomed to organizing and classifying knowledge that it had difficulty recognizing something that did not fit any existing classification. The Archmaesters were polite, they were learned. Several of them were genuinely brilliant. But Archmaester Marwyn, the exception, pulled Sam aside and told him that the Citadel had been dealing in information long enough to develop a sophisticated relationship with inconvenient truths. Some inconvenient truths, Marwyn implied, had been quietly filed away rather than acted upon. Sam held that thought as he walked out into the Oldtown evening and looked up at the Hightower's light. In the endgame of the series, the knowledge that Sam uncovers in Oldtown, in the Citadel's archives, with the help of information that threads through Oldtown's extraordinary historical records, becomes one of the mechanisms by which Jon Snow's true identity is established, the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, the legitimate heir to the Iron Throne, a secret that the Seven Kingdoms' fate may hinge upon. And this truth, when it emerges through the Citadel's archives, through the institution in Oldtown, through the knowledge infrastructure that the Hightowers have, across 12,000 years of patient maintenance, made the indispensable centre of gravity for all significant information in Westeros. The Hightowers did not arrange for this particular truth to be discovered. They simply built the place where all truths eventually come to rest, and in that place this truth had been waiting. Let the image of the library settle over you now, those long quiet stacks, the slight breathing of old paper, the darkness between the shelves where so many answers are still sleeping, waiting for a reader who will not arrive until morning. The honey wine is moving outside the Citadel's walls, unhurried, carrying the city's reflections toward the sound. The Hightower's beacon is visible from here if you know which window to look through. It burns white, it burns steady. It has been burning, without interruption, for longer than the institution you are standing inside has existed. Let your breathing slow to the pace of the river. Let your thoughts release whatever they were holding and drift outward toward the dark water. There is nothing that needs resolving tonight. The records will still be there in the morning, the knowledge will keep, and for now, your watch is ended. But the Hightower's mastery of knowledge and commerce had one crucial vulnerability. It had been built during the era of the First Men, on foundations of accommodation and patience. Then the Andals came, and most of the old houses that had not learned the Hightower's kind of patience ceased to exist entirely. There is a kind of power that announces itself with swords and fire, and there is a kind of power that announces itself not at all. The second kind is rarer, and far more difficult to extinguish. We have been looking at the Hightower's relationship to knowledge and to their extraordinary tower, but tonight we go further back, to a moment roughly 6,000 years before the main series, when everything that the First Men had built in the south of Westeros was tested in the most violent way possible, the Andal invasion. Let those words arrive at whatever speed they choose. You do not need to tense against them. The violence of that era is long over, dissolved into the same deep past where all the old conflicts eventually dissolve. What matters for tonight, what is worth carrying gently into sleep, is not the violence itself, but the question it left behind. Why did the Hightowers survive when so many others did not? The Andals came from Essos. They crossed the narrow sea in waves, beginning perhaps 6,000 years before Aegon's conquest, and they came armed not only with iron weapons, a metal the bronze-equipped First Men could not match in the forge, but with a faith, the faith of the Seven, that gave their conquest a spiritual dimension the First Men's animist traditions struggled to counter. The Andals were not a unified army with a single general and a single plan. They came in waves, in separate groups, in warlike migrations rather than organised campaigns, and across the south of Westeros they were devastating. First Men kingdoms that had stood for thousands of years were dismantled. Noble houses that traced their lineages back to the founding of the continent were scattered or destroyed. The culture of the First Men in the south, their customs, their language in its original forms, their relationship to the weirwoods, was largely submerged beneath the incoming tide. Most of the First Men houses that chose to fight the Andals in the south fought them and lost. The iron superiority of the invaders was, in the initial phases of the conflict, simply too significant an advantage to overcome in open battle. But the great First Men houses that survived the invasion in the south did not all survive by fighting. Some of them survived by something more sophisticated, by reading the direction of the tide before it arrived on their particular shore, and making decisions that looked, at the time, like weakness or even betrayal, but proved, across the long view of centuries, to be something else entirely. House Hightower was among the most sophisticated readers of that tide. They looked at the Andal invasion not as a catastrophe to be resisted, but as a transformation to be navigated. And their navigation of it was so precise that they emerged from the other side of it with more power than they had going in. The Hightowers invited the Andals in. That is the essential fact, and it is worth dwelling on because it contradicts almost every instinct that the logic of conquest seems to demand. Every other noble house in the region was attempting to hold its borders and preserve its traditions against an incoming force that seemed intent on replacing both. The Hightowers opened their gates. They sent envoys to the Andal leaders with offers of alliance rather than declarations of resistance. They hosted Andal warriors in Oldtown. They entered into marriages with Andal noble families, giving their own daughters to Andal lords and accepting Andal women into their own bloodline in return. They did not do this from a position of weakness. Their walls were defensible, their city was prosperous, their tower still stood, unbroken by any conqueror in 12,000 years of occupation. They chose accommodation not because they had to, but because they understood something about the future that their neighbours had not yet grasped. What they understood was this: the Andals were not going away. The invasion was not a raid to be repelled or a siege to be outlasted. It was a demographic and cultural transformation that was going to reshape the south of Westeros, whether or not any particular house chose to cooperate with it. The question was not whether the world would change, but whether you would still be standing when it had finished changing. A house that fought the Andals and won a battle would still face the next wave, and the one after that, and the one after that. A house that made itself useful to the Andals, that offered what it had uniquely to offer, its city, its trade networks, its extraordinary position at the mouth of the Honeywine, would not be fighting waves. It would be riding them. The Hightowers chose to ride. It is worth sitting with the courage that choice actually required. To look at an invading force and say, "We will not fight you, we will absorb you," that is not the choice of cowards. It is the choice of people who are willing to be misunderstood in the short term in order to survive and even prosper in the long term. The first men houses around them who chose to fight were, in many cases, brave and proud and entirely willing to die for their honour. Many of them did die for their honour, and their descendants in the subsequent centuries were not there to be proud of anything. The Hightowers were still there. Their fire was still burning. Their city was still the largest in the south. They had paid for their survival in the currency of adaptation rather than in blood, and that particular currency proved to have a far better exchange rate. Part of the accommodation was religious. The Andals brought with them the faith of the Seven, a religion with a single divine entity, expressed through 7 aspects: father, mother, maiden, crone, smith, warrior, and stranger. The faith required its adherents to build septs, to maintain a clergy, to recognise the High Septon as the earthly representative of divine will. The original First Men religion had been animist, concerned with the gods in the trees, the weirwoods, the ancient greenseers who saw through the bark. The Hightowers, who had been tending their black stone tower for 6,000 years before the Andals arrived, converted to the new faith without, as far as any record suggests, particular internal conflict. They built a sept in Oldtown. They invited the priests of the Seven to establish themselves in their city, and in doing so, they gained something they had not previously had: access to the most powerful spiritual institution in the incoming civilization. What the Hightowers built in Oldtown was not just any sept. They built the Starry Sept, the most significant religious structure in the Western world, the seat of the High Septon, the place from which the faith of the Seven governed the spiritual lives of every Andal and every converted First Men family across the continent. The Starry Sept in Oldtown was, for centuries, what the Great Sept of Baelor in King's Landing would later become, the centre of institutional religion in Westeros. Pilgrims came to Oldtown for the same reasons they would later come to King's Landing: to see the High Septon, to have prayers blessed at the highest available level, to resolve theological disputes before the most authoritative religious court on the continent. And all of those pilgrims passed through a city governed by the Hightowers, along roads maintained by the Hightowers, in view of the Hightowers' beacon. The marriages that the Hightowers contracted during and after the Andal invasion did something else that is easy to underestimate from a comfortable distance. They introduced Andal blood into the Hightower line at precisely the moment when Andal blood was becoming the currency of legitimacy in the south of Westeros. A lord who could claim descent from both an ancient First Men family and a respected Andal lineage was, in the new social calculus of the post-invasion south, positioned better than a lord who could only claim one or the other. The Hightowers, by the time the Andal invasion had fully settled into the fabric of Westerosi culture, were neither purely First Men nor purely Andal. They were both. They carried the legitimacy of 12,000 years of First Men occupation alongside the cultural authority of Andal conversion. They were, in other words, exactly what the new Westeros required its leading families to be. The contrast with what happened in the north is instructive. The Andals never successfully crossed the neck, that marshy bottleneck that divides the upper half of Westeros from the lower. The First Men of the north, the Starks and their vassals, the families of the old kingdoms that had existed since the Age of the Long Night, remained First Men. They kept their old gods, they kept their weirwoods, they kept their ancient customs and their old language patterns and their relationship to the greenseers whose eyes look out from the bark of the pale trees. And the north remained, because of this, a place apart, culturally distinct, spiritually distinctive, resistant in ways that the south was not. Neither path was simply better. The north's resistance preserved something precious. The Hightower's accommodation preserved something else. What the accommodation preserved specifically was the family itself. The echo of this long-ago accommodation can be heard, very clearly, in the political marriages of the modern era of the series. Alarie Hightower, a daughter of the Lord of Oldtown, married Lord Mace Tyrell of Highgarden, becoming the mother of Margaery Tyrell and grandmother of the future queens, whose ambitions would reshape the politics of the Seven Kingdoms. Through this marriage, Hightower blood entered the Tyrell line, and through Margaery Tyrell's subsequent marriages to Renly Baratheon, and then to King Joffrey and then to King Tommen, that Hightower blood moved closer to the Iron Throne than it had been in centuries. None of this was arranged in any single moment by any single person with a clear plan. It was the accumulation of the Hightower method, patient intermarriage, alliance over conflict, positioning without declaration. The family that learned to survive by making itself indispensable was still practicing the same lesson 6,000 years later. There is one more thread worth pulling, gently, from the Hightower tapestry of connection. Sir Jorah Mormont, the Bear Island Lord who became Daenerys Targaryen's most devoted protector across the narrow sea, whose love for her shaped her understanding of loyalty and sacrifice, had once been married to a Hightower woman. Lynesse Hightower, a daughter of Lord Leighton, accompanied Jorah to Bear Island after his tournament victory, found the grey northern island intolerably cold and austere after the warmth of Oldtown, and eventually left him for a merchant in Lys. The marriage failed entirely, but it is notable that a thread of Hightower connection runs even into the story of the exiled Dragon Queen's most faithful companion. The family's reach, through marriages and alliances and the web of connection that 4,000 years of deliberate accommodation had built, extends into almost every significant story the series has to tell. There is a final dimension of the Hightower accommodation that tends to be underappreciated because it is so structural as to be invisible. When the Hightowers converted to the faith of the Seven and began hosting Andal nobles in their city, they were not simply performing diplomacy, they were creating the conditions for a gradual demographic shift that would, over the subsequent centuries, produce a population in Oldtown that was mixed in origin but homogeneous in culture, a population that identified primarily as citizens of Oldtown and subjects of the Hightowers rather than as members of any particular invading or invaded group. The genius of this is that the Hightowers did not need to win a war to produce this outcome. They simply needed to make Oldtown welcoming enough and profitable enough and stable enough that the people who came to it over generations chose to stay. The city did the assimilating. The Hightowers provided the conditions, and after enough generations had passed, the distinction between conqueror and conquered had dissolved into the fabric of the city itself. Let those threads of connection settle into quiet now. Let the image of Oldtown in the years of the Andal transformation arrive gently, the city absorbing its new inhabitants the way a river absorbs rain, without drama, without resistance, without any alteration to its fundamental direction. The water moves south, the fire burns white, the black stone at the base of the tower neither welcomes nor resists the changes happening in the city above it. It simply endures, as it has always endured, as it will endure long after the Andals are as distant a memory as the First Men are now. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm of something very old and very steady. The Hightowers survived. They are still here. And the story of how they extended their reach even further into the soul of an entire civilization is waiting for you in the morning. For now, your watch is ended. The Hightowers had absorbed the Andals. They had converted to the Andals' faith and built the Andals' greatest holy site. But what happens when the power of that faith, the power of the Starry Sept, the power of the High Septon, becomes its own instrument? What happens when the family that lit the candle realizes that the candle has become something they can use? Breathe slowly. We're going deeper tonight into the question of quiet power, not the power of armies or gold, though those matter, but the power of something more intimate and more difficult to refuse, the power of the sacred. The Hightowers, having survived the Andal invasion by conversion and accommodation, found themselves in possession of something that their ancestors could not have anticipated when they first climbed the ancient black stone ruin on Battle Isle. They found themselves in possession of a relationship with the most important religious institution in the Western world, and in a world where every lord governed families who prayed to the same gods, who feared the same divine judgments, who could be brought to heel by the removal of religious blessing or driven to action by religious sanction. The family that controlled access to the sacred held a lever that no sword could match. The Hightowers had learned that lesson, and they held the lever with practiced care. The faith of the Seven is not a simple belief system. It is an institution, hierarchical, organized, geographically distributed across the continent, in a network of septs and septons and scepters who minister to the faithful at every level of society, from the humblest peasant village to the highest court. At the top of this hierarchy sits the High Septon, whose divine mandate gives him authority over matters of marriage, legitimacy, inheritance, and religious law that overlaps in crucial ways with secular law. A High Septon who decides that a marriage was invalid renders its children bastards. A High Septon who withholds the anointing from a king raises questions about that king's divine sanction to rule. A High Septon who calls for a holy war or a holy peace can move tens of thousands of people in ways that no lord's army can equal. This is not a minor power. This is among the most significant levers of social control in the known world. For most of the history of the faith in Westeros, for the thousands of years between the Andal invasion and the reign of the Targaryens, the High Septon resided not in King's Landing, which did not yet exist, but in Oldtown. In the Starry Sept, which the Hightowers had built and patronized and maintained as the centre of the faith's earthly operations. The Starry Sept is described in the histories as a building of extraordinary beauty, a seven-sided structure whose walls are inlaid with coloured glass that catches the morning light and scatters it across the floor in patterns that seem almost designed to produce a feeling of divine presence in the people who stand inside them. Whether this effect was intentional or incidental, it served the purpose. People who entered the Starry Sept felt, reliably, that they were in the presence of something larger than themselves. And the Hightowers had built the room in which that feeling arrived. Proximity to the sacred is its own form of power. A lord whose castle stands within walking distance of the seat of the High Septon receives visitors who come to pray and who, while in the city, conduct their business. He is the host of every diplomatic meeting that occurs in the margins of religious pilgrimage. He oversees the security of the city through which every aspiring priest must pass to receive ordination. He is the man whose goodwill the High Septon relies upon for the physical safety of his institution and the people within it. None of this requires the Lord to threaten the High Septon. None of it requires any explicit acknowledgement that power is being exercised at all. It simply requires the Lord to continue doing what he has always done, governing the city, maintaining the walls, keeping the harbour open, lighting the tower. The institution will understand without being told what it owes. We should sit with this particular form of power for a moment, because it is one that modern political systems have largely, though not entirely, moved away from. In the world of the main series, the fusion of religious and secular authority is still intimate enough that the removal of religious sanction can destabilize a crown. When the faith militant rises in the later books, and the High Sparrow takes control of the religious apparatus, the impact on the Seven Kingdoms is not marginal, it is existential. Cersei Lannister, one of the most politically sophisticated people in the main series, loses everything, including her freedom, because she underestimates the leverage that a sufficiently determined religious leader can exercise over a nominally secular power. The Hightowers did not underestimate this leverage. They had been living next to it and cultivating it for thousands of years. They knew exactly what the sacred was worth. Oldtown as a pilgrimage city had a character that Oldtown as a trading city did not. Traders come to a city with a purpose and leave when the purpose is fulfilled. Pilgrims come with something less defined, a need, a grief, a hope, a debt to something larger than themselves, and they move through the city more slowly, more receptively, more open to being shaped by what they find there. The streets around the Starry Sept were crowded on holy days with people from every part of the Reach and beyond, small folk who had walked for weeks, knights fulfilling vows, lords seeking annulments or blessings or the resolution of disputes that could not be settled by a local septon. All of them passed through gates maintained by the Hightowers. All of them rested in inns whose rents contributed in cascading ways to the economic infrastructure that the Hightowers governed. The city they passed through was an argument for the legitimacy of its governors made entirely in stone and light and the smell of incense on the morning air. The relationship between the High Septon of the Starry Sept and the Lord of the Hightower is never described in the histories as a relationship of subordination. Neither man is recorded as being formally under the authority of the other. But the practical arrangements of their coexistence tell a different story. The High Septon needed the city to function, which meant he needed the harbour to remain open, the food supply to remain stable, the streets to remain safe enough for pilgrims to walk without fear. The Lord of Oldtown provided all of these things, and the Lord of Oldtown needed the Starry Sept to remain in Oldtown rather than remove itself to some other city that might offer different conditions. The High Septon provided that as well by staying. Each man held the other's hand without quite gripping it. Each man understood what the other's continued cooperation was worth. This is the grammar of old power. When Aegon the Conqueror built King's Landing at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush and established it as his capital, the centre of gravity for the secular authority of Westeros shifted north and east. The Iron Throne, the court, the great lords who attended the king, all of these things concentrated themselves in the new city rather than the old one. This was, for the Hightowers, a reduction of their proximity to royal power. But it was not a reduction of their other powers. The Citadel remained in Oldtown, the Starry Sept remained in Oldtown, the Great Harbour remained in Oldtown, the Hightowers remained the most important family in the most important city in the Western world that was not King's Landing. And over the subsequent decades, as the High Septon gradually shifted his own residence northward to the new capital, the Hightowers watched another centre of gravity move away from them and began, quietly, to recalibrate. The construction of the Great Sept of Baelor in King's Landing, under the Targaryen King Baelor the Blessed, effectively completed the transfer of the faith's administrative centre from Oldtown to the capital. The High Septon no longer resided primarily in the Starry Sept. The grandest religious building in the realm was now in the north, in the Targaryen city, on the hill that overlooked the Iron Throne. The Hightowers had lost the most visible marker of their religious significance. What they had not lost, what could not be moved or replicated or replaced, was the Citadel, the training of every Maester, the management of every Raven network, the education of every noble child in Westeros. These things remained in Oldtown. These things remained in the Hightowers city. And in the long calculus of power, the education of the people who would govern the realm proved more durable than the address of the High Septon. In the main series, when Cersei Lannister makes the catastrophic decision to arm the Faith militant in order to use the High Sparrow as a weapon against her enemies, she's attempting to do what the Hightowers had done for centuries, use the power of the sacred as a political instrument. The crucial difference is that the Hightowers never tried to wield the Faith directly. They created conditions favourable to the Faith and allowed the Faith to be disposed to them in return. Cersei attempted to deploy the Faith as a tool, which required the Faith to understand itself as a tool, a misunderstanding that the High Sparrow corrected, with consequences that reshaped the last books and seasons of the story. The Hightowers, watching from Oldtown, had built their relationship with the Faith on the opposite premise. Not that the sacred serves the secular, but that the secular creates conditions in which the sacred can flourish. That distinction is everything. There is one more thread worth following into the modern era of the story. The glass candles of the Citadel, magical objects that, according to the institution's own tradition, had not functioned for centuries, if they had ever functioned at all, begin to burn in the time of the main series. Archmaester Marwyn, one of the few scholars at the Citadel willing to take seriously the evidence that magic is returning to the world, sees this as confirmation of something he has suspected for years, that the Citadel's official skepticism about magic has always been more than purely intellectual. Something, he believes, has been working for centuries to make the world inhospitable to the supernatural. And if magic is now returning, if the glass candles are now burning, it means that something about the conditions that suppressed it has changed. In Oldtown, in the Hightowers' shadow, the candles are burning again, and no one is quite sure what that means yet. The Hightowers also maintained something that is easy to overlook, but significant in the context of how religious power actually operates. They were consistent. Across the centuries of their patronage of the faith, they did not suddenly withdraw their support when it became inconvenient, did not redirect their resources away from the sept when a more immediately profitable option appeared. Consistency in religious patronage is extraordinarily valuable, because religious institutions are, above all, institutions. They need reliable funding, reliable physical security, reliable political protection from the inevitable disputes that arise when they make rulings that one party finds unjust. The Hightowers provided all of this, without drama, across the entire span of the faith's presence in Oldtown, and an institution that has received reliable patronage for a very long time develops, as a matter of institutional psychology, a disposition toward the patron that no individual act of generosity could purchase. The Hightowers were not merely generous, they were dependable, and in the long history of the faith, dependability was rarer and more valuable than generosity. There is something worth noting about what the Hightowers did not do with the Starry Sept and the Faith of the Seven, because the list of things they did not do is in some ways as instructive as the list of things they did. They did not attempt to appoint High Septons. They did not try to control the faith's theological decisions. They did not use their position as the faith's principal patrons to extract favourable rulings in disputes where their interests were at stake, or if they did, there is no record of it, which suggests they were either discreet or restrained. They let the institution be what it needed to be, in the same way they let the Citadel be what it needed to be. The Hightowers understood that the value of the institutions in their city depended entirely on those institutions maintaining their independence and their integrity. An institution that is perceived as the Hightower family's instrument is far less powerful than an institution that is perceived as genuinely autonomous. The Hightowers protected that autonomy because they understood what it was actually worth. Let the soft light of the sept settle over you now. Let the coloured glass cast its patterns on the floor of your imagination, and then fade gently as the window behind it dims into evening. The prayers have been said. The pilgrims have returned to their inns. The High Septon has retired to his chambers, and the city around the Starry Sept is quieting the way all cities quiet when the sacred work of the day is done. You're allowed to release all of this. The faith will still be here in the morning. The sept will still be standing, its walls still holding the light of every candle that has ever burned in it. Let your breathing slow to the cadence of someone who has prayed and been answered and found, in the answer, a reason to rest. The Hightowers built this room. You're allowed to rest in it. Your watch is ended. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The Hightowers had survived conquest and conversion, and the slow migration of power toward a city that had not existed when their tower was already old. But through all of it, they had never been kings in their own right. Or had they? Because before the Targaryens, before the Andals, before almost anyone alive in the main series can remember, the Hightowers wore crowns. Let your body sink a little deeper into the surface beneath it. Notice the weight of your own arms, your legs, the back of your head, the way gravity holds you without effort or invitation, simply because this is what gravity does. Power, at its most fundamental, is something like gravity in this way. You do not have to declare it. You do not have to threaten anyone with it. You simply are, and the world arranges itself around the fact of your being. We have been following the Hightowers through their relationships with knowledge and with faith, but there is another layer to this history that we have not yet reached. A layer that most people who know the name Hightower have never encountered, because it predates the family's connection to the Citadel and the faith by thousands of years. Before the Hightowers were the family that lit the way, they were something more explicit. They were kings. And the story of how they stopped being kings is, in its own way, one of the shrewdest political maneuvers in the history of Westeros. In the centuries and millennia before Aegon the Conqueror, Westeros was not a single kingdom. It was many kingdoms, some vast like the Kingdom of the North that stretched from the Wall to the Neck, and some small, the petty kingdoms that existed as relatively autonomous powers within larger regional structures. The Reach was the largest and most fertile of the southern regions, governed in its greatest extent by House Gardener of Highgarden, whose kings styled themselves Kings of the Reach and ruled from their castle in the breadbasket of the continent. But within the Reach, not every lord answered to the gardeners in all things at all times. Oldtown, with its extraordinary wealth and its independent political tradition going back 12,000 years, had its own relationship to regional power. The Hightowers had been, at various points in their long history, kings in their own right, lords of the Honeywine, self-styled rulers of Oldtown and the surrounding lands. The histories are not always clear about the precise nature and extent of the Hightower claim to kingship, partly because the relevant records are very old, and partly because the Hightowers themselves, once the question became inconvenient, did not emphasize it. But the tradition is there in the older chronicles, a line of Hightower rulers who used the title of king, who governed the city and the surrounding countryside as an independent polity, who conducted foreign policy with other kingdoms, rather than simply executing the orders of a gardener suzerain. This was not unusual in pre-Targaryen Westeros, where the map of petty kingdoms shifted constantly as families rose and fell, and marriage alliances restructured the political landscape every few generations. What was unusual about the Hightowers was how gracefully and how advantageously they managed the transition from petty kingship to great lordship, a transition that most kingdoms experienced as catastrophe, and the Hightowers experienced as an upgrade. When Aegon Targaryen landed at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush with his two sisters and their 3 dragons, in 299 years before the main series, the map of Westeros had not fundamentally changed in centuries. The great kingdoms, the North, the Riverlands, the Vale, the Westerlands, the Reach, the Stormlands, the Iron Islands, were arrayed as they had been for generations, and they faced the prospect of Targaryen conquest with varying degrees of alarm. The last great alliance against Aegon, the combined forces of the Reach under King Mern of House Gardener and the Westerlands under King Loren of House Lannister, met the Targaryens in the open field and discovered what it meant to face 3 dragons at once. The Field of Fire, as it came to be known, killed the Gardener King and thousands of his men, and effectively ended serious military resistance to the Targaryen conquest south of the Neck. Oldtown did not send its forces to the Field of Fire. Lord Manfred Hightower, the lord who governed the city at the time of the conquest, watched the news arrive from the north and made a calculation that was, in retrospect, exactly right. He consulted with the High Septon, who had been praying for guidance and had received it in the form of a vision. And then the gates of Oldtown were opened. Aegon Targaryen rode into the city as a conqueror who had met no resistance, and the High Septon anointed him king of all Westeros in the Starry Sept while the Hightower's beacon burned above the ceremony. In exchange for this capitulation, and it was a capitulation however gracefully arranged, the Hightowers kept Oldtown. They kept their title, their wealth, their position. They went from being petty kings governing an independent city to being the highest-ranking lords in the wealthiest region of the largest kingdom in the Western world. The surrender was a promotion. It is worth sitting with the sophistication of that decision. Aegon the Conqueror had dragons. He had already demonstrated at the Field of Fire what his dragons did to infantry formations in the open, and what they would presumably do to city walls and city streets if a city chose to resist. The Hightowers, who had survived 12,000 years by reading the direction of history and positioning themselves on the right side of it, read the direction of this particular history with complete clarity. Fighting would have meant the burning of Oldtown, the destruction of the Citadel, the loss of everything the family had spent millennia building. Yielding meant losing a title that was, in practical terms, less significant than the web of real power the family had accumulated. The crown was the least important thing they possessed. They gave it away with open hands and received in return the conqueror's respect and the preservation of everything that actually mattered. After the submission, Oldtown was formally incorporated into the new Targaryen kingdom. A warden was not appointed. The city did not require that kind of supervision. The Hightowers continued to govern it as they always had, through the same institutions, with the same authority over the same matters, The ships still came to the harbour. The Citadel still trained its maesters. The Starry Sept still received its pilgrims, though its role would shift in the decades that followed as the new capital drew religious authority northward. What changed was the formal structure at the top, the title that the Hightower patriarch used to describe himself, the name of the king to whom he theoretically owed fealty. What did not change was the actual substance of Hightower power, their city, their wealth, their relationships, their tower, their fire. The formal structure was a frame. The actual power was the picture inside the frame, and the picture had not been moved. The contrast with House Gardener is worth holding for a moment, quietly, the way you might hold a stone that reminds you of the ocean it came from. The Gardeners chose to fight. They gathered the largest army they could assemble, allied with the Lannisters, and met the Targaryens on the Reach's own soil. King Mern of House Gardener died at the Field of Fire, his sons died, his relatives died. House Gardener as a dynastic entity ceased to exist on that day, and the family that replaced them as Lords of Highgarden, House Tyrell, the stewards who had managed Highgarden's practical affairs for generations, were raised to that position by Aegon specifically because they had not fought. The Tyrells, like the Hightowers, had understood that accommodation was the path to survival. The Gardeners' courage was genuine and their pride was real. And they paid for both with the complete extinction of their line. There is a philosophy embedded in the Hightower choice that runs deeper than mere pragmatism, though pragmatism is certainly part of it. It is a philosophy about the difference between power and position, about the fact that formal titles and actual authority are not the same thing, and that confusing them is one of the most common and most expensive mistakes a great family can make. The Hightowers, across their 12,000 years of existence, had demonstrated repeatedly that they understood this distinction. They had absorbed the Andal invasion without being destroyed by it. They had built their relationship with the faith without requiring the faith to be formally under their authority. They had established the Citadel's significance without sitting on the conclave, and when the Targaryens came, they surrendered the least important thing they had, the kingship, and preserved the most important things. This is not weakness. It is the most precise possible understanding of what you actually value. In the modern era of the main series, this same philosophy can be heard, very faintly, in the way certain characters navigate the chaos of the War of the Five Kings. Tywin Lannister understands it. His famous line about the man who has to say he is the king, being no true king, captures the same principle that the Hightowers practiced for millennia. But Tywin's version is instinctive and tactical, deployed in individual situations rather than embedded as a generational philosophy. The Hightowers had something more structural, a tradition of identifying what actually matters, what can be sacrificed without real loss, and what must be protected at all costs. Their willingness to bend the knee to Aegon was not a departure from that tradition. It was a perfect expression of it. The knee that bends when the dragon comes will still be there to kneel on when the dragon has gone. In the present of the series, the Hightowers are conspicuously absent from the War of the Five Kings in any military sense. Lord Leighton Hightower does not march his forces north to join any of the claimants. He does not send his fleet to blockade anything. He is reportedly in his tower, engaged in whatever private work occupies him there. This absence from the spectacle of the war is entirely consistent with 12,000 years of Hightower practice. Do not commit your assets to someone else's conflict unless you have already determined who will win it and what your reward will be. The war is being fought, in the main series, largely by men who do not fully understand the terrain they are fighting over. The Hightowers understand the terrain better than any family alive, and they are waiting, as they have always waited, for the moment when their particular kind of patience becomes relevant again. The relationship between the Hightowers and the Targaryens in the generations after the conquest is notable for its relative lack of drama, which is itself a form of drama when you examine it carefully. The Hightowers served on small councils. They provided maesters to the Red Keep from the Citadel in their city. They attended the great tournaments and the great weddings and the state funerals that punctuated the Targaryen dynasty's long reign. But they did not become the political obsession of any particular Targaryen king. They were not the family that kept finding itself on the wrong side of a succession crisis, not until the Dance of Dragons, which is a different story. They occupied the political landscape of the early Targaryen era, the way the Hightower occupies the skyline of Oldtown, always present, always significant, never the thing that anyone was looking directly at, but always the reference point by which other things were located and understood. This is not accident. This is what a family that has survived 12,000 years looks like when it is operating normally. One more dimension of the Hightower submission deserves attention before we move past it. The role of the High Septon in the ceremony of Aegon's anointing. By hosting the most sacred moment of the Targaryen conquest, the moment when Aegon received divine sanction for his reign, in Oldtown the Hightowers transformed their city into the spiritual birthplace of the new dynasty. This was not something any other city could claim. King's Landing might be the political capital. But the anointing had happened in the Starry Sept, on Hightower land, with the Hightower beacon burning above the ceremony. This was the kind of precedent that did not expire. Every subsequent Targaryen who wanted to claim the same divine sanction their ancestor had received would be looking, implicitly, toward Oldtown, toward the tradition that had begun in the Hightowers city. The submission had written the Hightowers into the founding mythology of the dynasty they had chosen not to fight. That is not a small return on a bent knee. Let the image of the open gates settle over you now. Aegon riding into the city that had decided with great precision not to burn. The High Septon placing a crown on the head of a man whose dragons were still circling somewhere above the harbour. The Hightower beacon burning white, as it had always burned, indifferent to the ceremony happening below it, and yet providing, as it had always provided, the light by which the ceremony could be seen. You can let go of all of that now. You can let it settle into the dark the way sediment settles to the bottom of a still pool. Slowly, without resistance, until the water above it clears. Let your breathing slow. The kings who bent the knee are sleeping in their tombs now. Their descendants still live in the tower above those tombs, and the fire they light still finds the ships in the dark. Your watch is ended. The Hightowers had bent the knee. They had traded a crown for something more durable, but the most quietly extraordinary thing they had done, the thing that affected every single person in Westeros without any of those people knowing it, was something they accomplished not through diplomacy or religion or marriage, but through the management of information itself, and the full weight of that management has never quite been reckoned with. Let your thoughts drift quieter now. There is a particular quality of night that is not quite dark, a residual luminance, a glow from somewhere beyond the visible horizon that makes the outlines of things faintly visible without making them exactly clear. The history we are entering now has that quality. It is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It is not a villain in a room pulling threads. It is something stranger and more ambient than that. A set of arrangements that, taken together, have shaped the fate of an entire civilization across many centuries without any single person intending all of them, or understanding all of them, or even being aware of most of them. The Citadel trains maesters. Maesters go to castles. In castles they tend ravens and manage correspondence, and educate children and advise on policy and prescribe medicine. This sounds simple. This sounds like the reasonable administration of a learned institution, but let yourself follow the logic of it to its end and see what shape it takes. A maester who arrives at a new castle is a stranger in a household that has existed without him. He must earn trust. He must prove his usefulness. He does this through competence and discretion, through being the person who heals the Lord's child when the fever comes, who correctly predicted the early frost and allowed time for the harvest to be brought in, who drafted the letter to the neighbouring lord in language that preserved the lord's dignity while making the necessary concession. Over months and years the master becomes indispensable. He becomes in many households the person the lord trusts most, more than the captain of the guard, more than the master of coin, sometimes more than the lord's own family. And this trusted person, this quietly indispensable presence, was shaped in all his fundamental intellectual habits by the institution in Oldtown. He carries Oldtown with him, invisibly, into every castle he serves. The Raven network deserves a second, slower look. In military terms, information is often described as the key advantage, knowing where the enemy is, what he intends, when he will move. In the Seven Kingdoms, the Raven network is the primary mechanism by which this information moves. It moves between castles that have trained pairs of ravens, and it moves through maesters, who are the ones who read the messages, who decide which messages require the Lord's immediate attention, and which can wait, who compose the responses, who manage the birds themselves. A master who is even subtly selective about what information reaches his lord, not lying, not fabricating, simply prioritizing and framing and choosing what to include and what to mention in passing. can shape a lord's understanding of the world in ways the lord would find very difficult to detect and very difficult to object to, even if he suspected it. In the pages of A Feast for Crows, Archmaester Marwyn of the Citadel tells Samwell Tarly something that does not appear anywhere in the official history of the institution. He says that the Citadel has been killing dragons for 100 years. He does not mean physically, he means culturally, intellectually, systematically. The dragons of the Targaryen dynasty dwindled across the reigns of several kings. The last dragons were small and sickly things. They died young. The Targaryens could not explain why their most significant advantage, the thing that had allowed Aegon to conquer an entire continent, was slowly disappearing from the world. And Marwyn's implication is that the maesters, who were present at court, who managed the Targaryen children's education, who provided the medical care for both the humans and presumably the dragons, these men may have contributed through small choices and subtle recommendations to the conditions in which dragons could not survive. Not with swords, with knowledge. We should sit with that implication for a moment before deciding what to make of it, because it is a significant claim, and the evidence for it is largely inferential. What we know for certain is this: the dragons died. The Targaryens, the greatest practitioners of magic in the recent history of Westeros, lost their most significant magical asset across several generations during which maesters were deeply embedded in their court. We know that the Citadel has, historically, taken a skeptical view of magic, not hostile exactly, but consistently framing magical claims as superstition, consistently training its students to look for rational explanations for phenomena that might otherwise be attributed to the supernatural. We know that this skepticism, once installed in the minds of the ruling class, created a cultural environment in which magical practice received less support and less belief. Whether this was intentional policy or the natural consequence of rationalism is precisely what we cannot know, and perhaps that uncertainty is the point. In the Citadel there are objects called glass candles. They are made of obsidian, the volcanic glass that is also, perhaps not coincidentally, one of the few substances known to kill the others, the ancient enemy from the north. The glass candles were supposedly used in ancient times as communication devices, magical instruments that allowed people in different locations to speak to one another across vast distances, in the same way that a raven carries written words but a glass candle could carry something more immediate. The Citadel maintains a collection of them. Its official position, taught to every novice who encounters them, is that the glass candles cannot be lit, that whatever magical property they once possessed has long since departed, along with all the other magic that used to exist in the world and no longer does. A first-year student takes this in and files it away as fact. Magic is old. Magic is gone. These candles are merely decorative, and then, in the time of the main series, one of the glass candles begins to burn. Samwell Tarly hears about this from Archmaester Marwyn. It burns, just like that, with no intervention, as magic begins to return to the world alongside the dragons that Daenerys Targaryen is raising across the narrow sea. The candle's ignition means that the world's conditions have changed, that whatever suppressed the magical properties of the candle has shifted, loosened, retreated enough for the old functionality to reassert itself, and it means something else, that the Citadel's official position, maintained so consistently and so authoritatively for so many centuries, may have been describing not the permanent nature of the world but a temporary state that was now ending. The maesters had told their students that magic did not work. The candle, burning quietly in a room in the Citadel, was politely informing the institution that it had been wrong. Marwyn's response to the burning glass candle was to leave. He gathered what he knew and what he suspected, and he departed Oldtown for Essos, heading toward the Dragon Queen, believing she would need someone who understood magic in the way the Citadel had historically refused to understand it. He did not say openly who he feared, but the implication was clear. Whatever forces within the Citadel had been working to suppress magic and keep the world rational and dark and dragon-free would not be pleased about what the candle represented. And those forces were not external enemies. They were the institution itself, or the part of it that had, across a very long time and without any single person directing it, made itself the guardian of a certain kind of world in which certain kinds of power did not exist. Marwyn was afraid of librarians. Specifically, he was afraid of what librarians who had been at it for 800 years could quietly accomplish. Where do the Hightowers sit within all of this? They are not masters. They are not the architects of whatever the Citadel has or has not been doing across the centuries. but the Citadel exists in their city, on the banks of their river, in the shadow of their tower. And the Hightowers tower is built on a foundation of black stone that has magical resonances, connections to Ashai, to the sea stone chair, to whatever civilization predates human memory in this world. Lord Leighton Hightower is, in the present of the series, reportedly engaged in something arcane at the top of his tower, with his daughter, who has apparently been reading every book in the library for a decade. The Citadel is suppressing magic. The Hightowers are possibly practicing it. These two things, happening simultaneously in the same city, suggest that Oldtown's relationship with the supernatural is more complicated than the Citadel's official curriculum would have anyone believe. When Sam arrives at the Citadel, he's eventually granted access to a restricted section of the library, a section where books are kept that the Citadel does not make freely available. He finds there information about the Long Night, about the Others, about the magical weapons that can fight them. Information that the Citadel officially treats with skepticism, but has quietly preserved anyway, the way libraries sometimes preserve things they do not entirely endorse. This is characteristic of institutions that have existed long enough to understand that the categories of relevant and irrelevant knowledge are not permanent. The Citadel does not destroy what it suspects might not be true. It files it. It keeps it in a place that requires permission to access. It maintains the knowledge while publicly maintaining skepticism about that knowledge. This is not dishonesty exactly. It is the posture of an institution that has lived long enough to know the future is not always what the present expects. The most significant information that flows through the Citadel's archives in the main series is not about dragons or others or glass candles. It is about a marriage. Specifically, it is about a secret ceremony performed in Dawn, before witnesses, between Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. A ceremony that made their son, raised as Jon Snow by Eddard Stark, not a bastard but the legitimate heir to the Iron Throne. The evidence for this ceremony, when it is finally assembled, comes significantly from records kept in the Citadel. A maester's diary, a church record, the accumulated documentation of an institution that records things carefully and keeps them in a place unlikely to burn. The truth about Jon Snow's identity, the truth that may determine the fate of every living person in the Seven Kingdoms, was sitting in Oldtown, in the Hightowers' shadow, waiting to be found. The Hightowers did not put it there, but it was in their keeping. There is a conversation that Archmaester Marwyn has with Samwell Tarly in A Feast for Crows that is worth holding in the mind for a moment. Marwyn tells Sam that he should leave before the other Archmaesters learn what Sam has told him. Learn that Sam has seen the others, that the threat is real, that the world north of the Wall is not the empty superstition they have been quietly teaching every student at the Citadel to believe in. Marwyn is afraid of his colleagues. Not physically afraid. He's a man who has travelled to the edges of the known world and studied things that most maesters would not touch. He is institutionally afraid. He understands that the Citadel's consensus, once mobilised against an inconvenient truth, is more than sufficient to suppress that truth for another generation. The institution has done it before. It knows how. And Marwyn, who believes in magic, who has kept a glass candle in his rooms for years, who is perhaps the only person in the Citadel who has been watching for this moment, knows that he is outnumbered, and that the correct response is not to fight, but to leave. He chooses the path the Hightowers would have chosen. The Hightowers' relationship to all of this, to the Citadel's possible role in the suppression of magic, to the glass candles, to the returning supernatural forces that are reshaping the world in the time of the main series, is perhaps best understood as the relationship of a very old family to a very old building. They did not design the building. They did not write its rules. But they have lived next to it for long enough that they understand it better than the people who are formally in charge of it. They know which rooms are locked and which rooms are open. They know what it is capable of, and what it is afraid of, and what it is prepared to do to preserve the particular version of the world that it has decided to maintain. And they have, in the person of Lord Leighton and his daughter Melora, apparently decided that the moment has arrived to work with something adjacent to the Citadel's official reality, rather than within it. What that work is, precisely, remains their own counsel. But it seems safe to say that the Hightowers, who have been reading the direction of history for 12,000 years, have noticed which way this particular wind is blowing. Let your mind release all of that now. Let the library go dark, one reading lamp at a time, the scholars retreating to their sleep. Let the glass candle burn quietly in its room with no one to observe it. Let the ravens settle on their perches, tucking their heads beneath their wings, carrying their encoded information into the stillness of sleep. The Honeywine moves past the Citadel's walls without comment. The Hightower's beacon is visible from the window if you choose to look, but you do not need to look. It is there. It has always been there. It will be there in the morning. Let your own thoughts settle into something like the quiet of a library after closing. All that accumulated knowledge at rest in the dark, patient, going nowhere, waiting for a reader who will arrive when the time is right. Your watch is ended. Knowledge is one form of power. Faith is another. Accommodation, a third. But there is a fourth form of power that the Hightowers had never quite deployed, the power of proximity to a throne, and for one extraordinary generation they placed a daughter at the very centre of the greatest dynasty in Westerosi history, and in doing so, they brought the entire realm to the edge of civil war. Breathe slowly. We have been moving through history that is broad and deep and systemic, the history of institutions and philosophies and quiet arrangements made across centuries. Now we narrow to a single life, a single woman, a single generation in which the Hightowers came closer to wearing a crown than at any point in their 12,000-year history. Closer, and then failed, not catastrophically, not in the way that ends dynasties, because the Hightowers do not end catastrophically. They absorb, they recalibrate. But they failed in the most immediate and personal sense, in the person of Alicent Hightower, who was a queen and the mother of a king, and who fought for that king with every resource she possessed, and who watched in the end as the war she had shaped consumed the thing she had been fighting to preserve. Let yourself receive that story gently. There is no need to brace against it. It happened a long time ago, and the tower is still standing. Alicent Hightower was the daughter of Sir Otto Hightower, and it is impossible to understand her story without understanding his first. Otto Hightower was the hand of the king, the second most powerful position in the realm, under not one but two Targaryen kings. Jaehaerys the Conciliator, who was the longest reigning Targaryen and the king under whom the realm was most stable, and Viserys I, who was Jaehaerys' grandson and the king under whose reign the dynasty's fundamental fracture lines became impossible to ignore. Otto was brilliant in the way that courtiers who last are always brilliant, not dazzling, not memorable for flashes of individual genius, but consistently competent, consistently reliable, consistently present in the places where decisions were being made. He understood something about power that Westeros's most celebrated figures often missed, that proximity is more valuable than rank, and that proximity, maintained across enough years, eventually becomes indistinguishable from power itself. When King Viserys I found himself a widower following the death of his first wife, Aemma Arryn, the question of remarriage was immediately and pressingly political. The king had a daughter, Rhaenyra, whom he adored, and whom he named his heir, an unusual and in some eyes unprecedented choice, but no male heir, and the absence of a male heir in a world that had not previously experienced female succession was, to many of the great lords, a source of genuine anxiety. Viserys needed a new wife. The field of candidates was large. It was Otto Hightower as Hand of the King, who arranged for his own daughter Alicent to be in the king's presence consistently enough that affection could develop on its own apparent terms. Whether Alicent was a willing participant in her father's design, or a young woman genuinely navigating an impossible situation, most likely she was both. She became Queen of the Seven Kingdoms at an age when most young women of her station were still negotiating their first betrothal. What makes Alicent Hightower's story genuinely tragic rather than merely politically interesting is that she and Rhaenyra Targaryen had been friends. The old histories, and the television series House of the Dragon which dramatise their conflict, are emphatic on this point. Before the politics hardened around them, before the succession question became the hinge on which the fate of the dynasty swung, these two young women had been close. They had grown up in proximity at court. They had shared something that the word friendship only imperfectly captures, the mutual recognition of two intelligent people in a world that gave neither of them the options their intelligence deserved. The fact that they became enemies is not simply the story of two women on opposite sides of a dynastic dispute. It is the story of what happens when a political system is constructed in such a way that two people who should be allies are made, by the logic of that system, into adversaries. When King Viserys I died, after a long and painful illness in his bed, as peacefully as a man can die when his own body has spent years destroying itself, the question of succession became the most dangerous question in the realm. Viserys had named Rhaenyra his heir explicitly years before his death, in a ceremony before the Great Lords. He had repeated this designation multiple times, and yet on the day he died, the small council, with Alicent at its centre and her son Aegon at its nominal head, acted as though this designation had not been made. They crowned Aegon II before Rhaenyra's supporters could respond. The logic, or rather the argument, was that a queen regnant was unprecedented, that the realm would not accept female succession, that Aegon was the more appropriate heir. The counter-argument was that the king had said, clearly and repeatedly, what he wanted. The realm was about to discover what happened when those two arguments could not be resolved. The Dance of Dragons, the civil war that followed, is called this, and the name captures something real about its nature. It was fought between two parties who both had dragons, and the dragons died along with the people who rode them. The great Targaryen dragons that had intimidated the continent for nearly 300 years were decimated in a conflict between members of the same family. Vhagar, the oldest and largest of the living dragons, fell in single combat. Meleys, the Red Queen, died. Sunfire, Aegon II's dragon, was badly injured and never fully recovered. The Blacks and the Greens fought with dragon against dragon in the sky above the Riverlands and the Crownlands and the Gullet, and when the fighting was over, almost all of the dragons were gone. The thing that had made the Targaryens extraordinary, the thing that Aegon the Conqueror had used to give the family its crown, had been consumed by the family's internal conflict. The Hightowers had done this, or at least the Hightowers had started it. Alicent herself, through all of this, occupied a position that no simple word quite captures. She was the Queen Dowager. She was the mother of a king whose claim she had fought for. She was a Hightower woman who had never forgotten what it meant to be a Hightower, the patience, the strategic long view, the understanding that position must be maintained through relationships rather than through force alone. But she was also a woman who had watched her father removed from power, who had seen the people she trusted most either die or fail her, who had found that the court she had navigated with such precision for so many years was more violent and less controllable than her precision could manage. She had played the Hightower game, the quiet game, the patient game, in an arena that had escalated past the point where quiet patience was enough. And she had discovered that the game she had trained for was not the game she was actually playing. Aegon II, the king whose reign the Hightowers had effectively engineered, did not have a long or glorious reign. He was injured early in the war, his dragon badly wounded, his own body broken in ways that never fully healed. He ruled from a position of pain and weakness, while his mother and his small council managed the actual business of governance. The war went badly. Rhaenyra's forces took the capital, and in the end, Aegon II died, poisoned most likely by his own supporters, who had concluded that the only way to end the war was to remove the person whose claim was sustaining it. His supporters then placed on the throne his nephew Aegon III, Rhaenyra's son. The crown passed to the Black faction in the end. The Hightowers' great political gamble, the one they had made by placing their daughter on the throne, had not worked. And yet, the Hightowers were still there, still in Oldtown, still lighting the way. The long shadow of the Dance of Dragons falls across every event in the main series, because the dance was the thing that killed the dragons. Not the last dragons, not immediately, but the beginning of the process. Before the dance, the Targaryens had many dragons. After the dance, they had a few. After a few more decades, they had none. The family that had ruled Westeros through a combination of legitimate authority and the implicit threat of fire retained the legitimate authority but lost the fire. And a dynasty that rules through fear of a weapon that no longer exists is a dynasty in the early stages of something it has not yet named. By the time Robert Baratheon put his hammer through Rhaegar Targaryen's chest on the trident, the Targaryens had been ruling without the thing that had made their conquest possible for over a century. The dance, which the Hightowers had initiated, had taken from the Targaryens the most essential piece of what they were. In the main series, the character who most clearly echoes Alicent Hightower is Cersei Lannister, a queen whose sons are the ruling kings, who fights to maintain the dominance of her line against a claim she considers less legitimate, who finds that her intelligence and her will are not equal to the violence of the world she's trying to control. The parallel is so close that it almost constitutes a structural argument in the narrative itself. The story of a fierce, brilliant woman who uses every tool available to her in a world that does not give women formal tools, who fights and schemes and sacrifices and ultimately loses. There are differences. Cersei is louder, more impulsive, more prone to the satisfying mistake. Alicent seems to have had more patience, more Hightower discipline. But neither of them found a way to make quiet power sufficient in a world that had decided to become loud. Otto Hightower's removal as Hand of the King is one of the pivotal moments of the Dance of Dragons, because it took away from Alicent the person who had designed the position she was in and who had the coldest eye in the room for what it required. Viserys dismissed Otto because he found his father-in-law's scheming too visible, too aggressive, too naked in its ambition on behalf of Alicent's children. What this dismissal revealed was a structural vulnerability in the Hightower plan. The plan required at every stage someone who was willing to be explicit about what they wanted, and Otto had been that person. Without him, Alicent had to become more explicit herself, had to advocate more openly for the succession that her father had been manoeuvring toward. An open advocacy is always more vulnerable than hidden preparation. The Hightowers had always known this. It was why they had spent 12,000 years not saying openly what they wanted. Otto's removal forced Alicent to say it openly, and once she had said it, she could not unsay it. What the Dance of Dragons ultimately represents, in the long history of House Hightower, is the one time the family tried to play the game at the highest possible level and at the highest possible speed, tried to move from quiet influence to explicit power in a single generation through the marriage of a daughter to a king and the positioning of a grandson on the throne. The Hightower method does not work at that speed. The Hightower method is specifically designed for timescales that individual human lives cannot comfortably inhabit, for arrangements that take generations to set in place and generations more to bear fruit. Trying to accelerate it to the speed of a single dynastic succession was like trying to make a 12,000-year tower in a decade. The materials don't have time to settle, the weight cannot be distributed properly, and something gives. In the dance, what gave was the stability of the Targaryen dynasty, and alongside it the lives of most of the dragons that had made the dynasty what it was. The Hightowers paid that price, and then they returned to Oldtown and resumed the patient work of being what they had always been. The Hightower women who appear in the margins of this history deserve a moment of attention, because they are the connective tissue of the story in a way that the formal accounts rarely acknowledge. Alicent is the most famous, but she was not alone. Hightower women married into the great families of the Reach across the entire span of the Hightower presence in Westeros, carrying with them the particular kind of formation that comes from growing up in a city built around knowledge and faith and the patient management of power. Whether they were conscious of it or not, they brought the Hightower understanding of how the world works into the households they married into. They were, in a sense, the family's most reliable export. Not gold, not soldiers, not ravens, but women who had learned, by example and by inheritance, what quiet power looks like when it is operating correctly. In a world that rarely gave women formal power, this was the channel through which the Hightower method moved most freely. Let Alicent rest now. Let her settle back into the long, deep history that contains her, a history that is old enough to absorb even the Dance of Dragons, even the near extinction of the Targaryen dragons, even the failure of the thing she gave her life to build. The Hightower beacon was burning the night she died, as it had been burning the night she was born, as it had been burning 12,000 years before her birth, and as it would burn 12,000 years after her death, if the world could hold together that long. Her name is still there in the histories. Her descendants' blood flows through the ruling families of Westeros in ways she could not have planned and did not live to see. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of her story release from your chest gently, the way a long-held breath releases. Your watch is ended. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The Hightowers had placed a queen on the throne and lost the war she started. But in Oldtown, far from the battlefields of the dance, something was still burning at the top of their tower. And the current lord, the lord who sits at the pinnacle of this ancient family in the time of the main series, is reportedly doing something in that tower that no one outside his family entirely understands. There are rooms in old buildings that suggest they are holding something, not because of any visible evidence, but because of the particular quality of silence around them. The silence is slightly thicker than it should be. The air near the closed door has a different temperature than the air a few steps away. You do not know what is in the room, but you know that something is. House Hightower in the time of the main series has this quality. The family is still there, still in Oldtown, still governing the greatest city in the south. But the Lord himself has been absent from public life for years, and the absence has a particular texture. It is not the absence of illness, not the withdrawal of age, not the retreat of grief. It is something more deliberate, more purposeful, more suggestive of someone who has decided that what is happening at the top of the tower is more important than what is happening anywhere else in the world. Let yourself sit with the mystery of that. Lord Leighton Hightower, the ruling lord of Oldtown in the time of the main series, has reportedly not descended from the upper floors of his tower in years. His administration of the city continues. Letters are sent, decisions are made, taxes are collected, the harbour operates. But the lord himself is not present for the daily operations that occupy every other governing lord in the Seven Kingdoms. He has, by all available accounts, withdrawn to the highest levels of the Hightower, and is engaged there in something that his household describes only as study. His daughter Melora, called the Mad Maid by the people of Oldtown, a title that carries in it equal parts affection and unease, has been with him. She has reportedly been reading, working through a collection of books whose contents and origins the family has not seen fit to explain. Two members of one of Westeros's most powerful families, in the oldest tower in the Western world, doing something with knowledge that they have chosen not to share. We do not know what Leighton and Melora Hightower are doing. This is one of the most significant gaps in the main series, a deliberate withholding, the narrative equivalent of a closed door at the top of a staircase that you have been climbing for several chapters. George R.R. Martin has not explained it. The characters who discuss it do so with the particular caution of people describing something they do not fully understand and are not entirely comfortable speculating about. Rumours circulate in Oldtown, as rumours always circulate about the powerful and the reclusive. There is talk of sorcery. There is talk of communication with forces that most sensible people in the modern era of Westeros do not believe are available to communicate with. There is talk of the glass candles, and of the ancient properties of the black stone at the tower's base, and of things that were known in earlier ages of the world, and that may be becoming knowable again. The glass candles matter here. We have mentioned them before, but in the context of Lord Leighton's sealed tower they take on a new dimension. The glass candles were supposedly communication devices, magical instruments that allowed their users to speak across vast distances in real time, to see into other places, to exchange information in ways that bypassed the slower medium of ravens and roads. If such instruments are beginning to function again, as Archmaester Marwyn believes, then the question of who is using them is not academic. The Hightower's tower is the oldest structure in Westeros, built on a foundation of the same black stone that appears in the most magically resonant locations in the known world. If magic is returning to the world, if the conditions that suppressed it are relaxing, then the top of the Hightower may be one of the places where that return is most immediately and most clearly felt. And the lord who lives there seems to know it. We should sit with what that might mean rather than hurrying toward a conclusion we do not have the information to reach. The temptation, when faced with a mystery of this kind, is to fill the empty space with the most dramatic story available. But the Hightower method has always been the opposite of dramatic. Whatever is happening in the top of that tower is consistent by all accounts, with something careful and deliberate and long thought through. Leighton Hightower did not ascend to the highest floor of his tower on impulse. Melora Hightower has been described as someone who has been gathering knowledge across years, methodically, in the way that someone gathers knowledge for a purpose rather than for curiosity alone. Whatever they are building up there, whatever understanding they are assembling from whatever sources, it fits the pattern of everything their family has ever done. Patient, precise, oriented towards something that they have not yet chosen to reveal. Imagine the upper floors of the Hightower at night, the city far below, its harbour lights, its market districts darkening as they close, the Honeywine catching the reflection of the moon and moving it southward toward the Sound. From 500 feet the sounds of the city are inaudible. The wind at that height comes from a different direction than the wind at street level, carrying different information, the smell of open water rather than the smell of fish and timber and human habitation. The beacon at the summit burns above even that, painting the underside of any nearby cloud in shifting warm light, and below the summit, somewhere in the upper section of the tower, a lamp burns in a window where a woman is reading. And near her, or perhaps above her, or perhaps in a room whose door does not open toward the corridor that leads down to the rest of the building, the lord of the tower is doing something in the dark. The black stone at the base of the high tower has properties that the Citadel's rational curriculum has never satisfactorily explained. It does not simply fail to match any known quarry. It resonates, in some accounts, with certain kinds of magical perception. The ability of greenseers and wargs and glass candle users to see through it, to use it as a kind of lens or amplifier for whatever faculties they possess. The seastone chair, made of the same material, has been associated by some historians with the prophetic traditions of certain iron-born priests. The ruins of Ashai, built partly of this stone, are associated with the most extreme and least categorizable magical practices in the known world. The black stone is not inert. It is not simply old. It is, in the understanding of those who take such things seriously, a material that has a relationship to the supernatural that predates everything that Westeros currently knows how to think about. The library of the High Tower is not the Citadel. It is older and smaller and far less organized, which means it likely contains things that the Citadel's more systematic archiving process has either not yet absorbed or has quietly chosen not to absorb. Books copied from older books, copied from scrolls written in the earliest years of the post-Andal era, carrying information about the period before the Andals arrived, about the practices of the first men, about the weirwoods and the greenseers and the relationship between the old gods and the trees they spoke through, and perhaps older than that, books whose provenance is uncertain, whose origin has never been fully traced, whose content covers a period that most Westerosi scholars treat as too remote and too fragmentary to be useful. Melora Hightower has reportedly been working through this material for years. Whatever she and her father are assembling from it, they have had a great deal of time to assemble it carefully. In the time of the main series, the return of magic to the world, the rebirth of Daenerys' dragons, the stirring of the others in the north, the glass candles beginning to burn, is happening simultaneously in multiple places and through multiple channels. The conventional political story of the series tends to foreground the military and dynastic dimensions of these events. Who sits the Iron Throne, who wins which battle, which alliance holds and which collapses. But running alongside that story in a different register is the story of magic's return to a world that has been without it for a long time. And in that story, the High Tower, the oldest magical structure in Westeros, occupied by a family that has been in continuous possession of it across 12,000 years, is almost certainly a significant location. We simply do not yet know in what way. The door is still closed, the lamp still burns in the window, and the world is changing in the dark outside. There is something deeply characteristic about the High Tower position in the present of the series. While the great families of Westeros, the Starks and the Lannisters and the Baratheons and the Tyrells, are consuming themselves in the War of the Five Kings, while the Iron Throne changes hands and allegiances fracture, and great armies are assembled and destroyed and rebuilt, the High Towers are not there. They are in their tower, which they have occupied for 12,000 years. They are reading and thinking and possibly practicing something that the rest of the realm has forgotten was possible. The history of Westeros has, on several occasions, arrived at a moment when the things that happened in towers were more significant than the things that happened on battlefields. The High Towers seem to understand this. They seem to be preparing for something, and the something they appear to be preparing for may have to do with a change in the nature of the world itself. The name Melora Hightower comes with the epithet the Mad Maid, and it is worth sitting with what that name implies and what it probably misrepresents. In the social vocabulary of Westeros, a noblewoman who does not marry, who does not perform the expected social functions of her class and gender, who spends her time in private study rather than in the management of household relationships, is described as mad. Not because she has lost her mind in any clinical sense, but because she has declined to inhabit the role that the world has assigned to her, and the world, when it cannot understand a woman's choices, tends to reach for the vocabulary of mental illness as a convenient explanation. What Melora is actually doing, working through the Hightower library systematically, studying materials that may include the oldest and least categorized documents in a library that goes back thousands of years, sounds less like madness and more like the most focused and purposeful use of her particular situation. She's in the oldest tower in the Western world, with access to its private archives, and she is reading. Whatever she's reading, it seems reasonable to assume that it is worth reading. The silence that the Hightower family maintains about what is happening at the top of their tower is, in one sense, simply another expression of their characteristic method. The Hightowers have never been a family that announced its activities before those activities were complete. They did not announce their decision to accommodate the Andals until the accommodation was accomplished. They did not announce the political manoeuvring that placed Alicent on the throne until Alicent was already there. They do not announce what Leighton and Melora are doing in the upper floors of their tower, and they will not announce it until the moment they have chosen to announce it, if that moment comes at all. This is infuriating to scholars and storytellers who want to know what is happening. But it is entirely consistent with a family that has always understood the difference between what is known and what is broadcast, and has always preferred to keep those two things as far apart as possible. What is perhaps most striking about the Hightower's situation in the present of the main series is the way it positions the family to be relevant to whatever comes next. The great conflict of the series, between the living and the dead, between the world of human politics and the supernatural force that is gathering beyond the wall, is a conflict in which knowledge about the old magic, about the old world, about the things that existed before human memory began, may prove more decisive than any army or any dragon. The Hightowers are sitting on the oldest structure in Westeros, built of a stone that resonates with magical traditions scattered across the entire known world, managed by a family that has preserved the longest continuous relationship with organised knowledge in the history of the continent. Whatever the White Walkers are, whatever the glass candles connect to, whatever ancient truth is embedded in the base of the High Tower itself, the family most likely to have been quietly accumulating. The relevant understanding for the last 12,000 years is currently locked in a tower working on it. Let the sealed door remain sealed, for now. Let the mystery remain a mystery, in the way that all the best mysteries do. Not because the answer is unreachable, but because the answer requires more time than this night contains. The lamp burns in the upper window of the tower. The beacon burns above it. The black stone foundation absorbs the slight tremor of the tides below, as it has absorbed them for an era so long that the word era no longer quite applies. You do not need to know what is happening up there tonight. You do not need to resolve the mystery before you sleep. The Hightowers have been managing their particular mystery for 12,000 years, and it will still be unresolved in the morning, and that is entirely fine. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts release their grip on whatever they have been holding. Your watch is ended. A tower with a sealed room at its top, a library full of books that no one else has read, a family that has survived every transformation that history has managed to produce. What is the final lesson that 12,000 years of patient power actually teaches? And what does it mean for everyone alive in the time of dragons and others, and glass candles that are now, finally, beginning to burn? We've been moving through 12,000 years of history, and we are almost at the end of it. Or rather, we are almost at the point where the history we have been following connects with the present of the story, with the time of Jon Snow and Daenerys and the others, and the war that will, or will not, save the living from the dead. Before we make that final connection, let yourself rest in the accumulation of what we have already covered. The tower, the black stone, the city that grew up around a mystery, the patient accommodation of the Andals, the religious power of the Starry Sept, the intellectual architecture of the Citadel, the voluntary submission that was really a promotion, the queen who almost won everything, the sealed door at the top of the oldest building in the Western world. Let these things sit beside each other in your mind without trying to force them into a single pattern. They are already a pattern. They have been one all along. The Hightower method, across 12,000 years, comes down to 3 instruments used in combination and in sequence, depending on what the moment required. The first instrument is knowledge, the family that controls the institution, that trains every administrator in the realm, controls the flow of information, the framing of policy, the education of the next generation of rulers. This is the Citadel, and the High Tower's relationship to it is the most fundamental expression of their power. The second instrument is legitimacy. A family that houses the greatest holy site in the realm and maintains a relationship with the religious institution that governs the souls of millions has access to a kind of authority that is immune to military defeat. You cannot kill a family's spiritual significance by winning a battle against them. This is the Starry Sept, and the Hightowers built it and maintained it because they understood that sacred space is real estate of particular and extraordinary kind. The third instrument is indispensability. A family that governs the largest trading port in the Western world, the city through which the greatest volume of commerce passes and has passed for 12,000 years, is not a family that any king or conqueror can afford to alienate. Oldtown's destruction would mean the loss of the Citadel, the loss of the Starry Sept's history, the loss of the harbour infrastructure that every merchant in the Reach depends on. No sensible conqueror destroys what he has just conquered. No sensible conqueror makes enemies of the people who manage the things he needs to run. The Hightowers made themselves so useful to the functioning of civilization that removing them would require replacing them, and they were not replaceable. This is perhaps the most durable form of power available in any political system, not the power to rule, but the power to be necessary. The power, in the end, of being the institution that makes other institutions possible. Hold that against the Lannister model, just for a moment, because the contrast is instructive. The Lannisters of Casterly Rock are rich. They are perhaps the richest family in the history of the Seven Kingdoms, their gold mines having produced wealth that no other single noble house has matched. They are militarily powerful, they are politically sophisticated, and across the main series, they are clearly the dominant force in the political life of the Southern Realm. But their power is visible, their wealth is declared, their influence is exercised loudly through presence, through announcement, through the spectacle of Lannister gold and Lannister lions and Lannister ambition. And visible power is vulnerable power. You can argue against it. You can resent it. You can, if circumstances change sufficiently, rise against it. The Lannister power that is so overwhelming in the first seasons of the story is largely spent by the last. The Hightower power that appears in almost no scenes is still fully intact. In the main series, the character who most successfully employs something like the Hightower method is Margaery Tyrell. And it is not a coincidence that she carries Hightower blood through her mother Allery. Margaery understands, instinctively, and in the way that people who have been well taught understand things, that power in a volatile political environment comes from being loved rather than feared, from making yourself useful to people rather than threatening them, from positioning yourself as the person whose departure would leave a gap no one else can fill. She visits the poor of King's Landing. She learns the names of the small folk. She's generous with resources in ways that cost her family relatively little, but purchase enormous goodwill. She plays the role of beloved queen with such commitment that the role becomes, in many ways, real. This is not naivete. It is the Hightower method applied to the politics of King's Landing. Be the light, make the harbour accessible, let others conclude on their own that they cannot afford to put it out. We should sit with the uncomfortable implication of that for a moment. What the Hightower method demonstrates, across 12,000 years of evidence, is that the most durable power is the power that does not need to be defended because it is not perceived as threatening. You cannot resent the lighthouse. You cannot build a resistance movement against the library. You cannot raise an army against the institution that educates your children because your children are in it. The Hightowers learned this so thoroughly that it became structural, built into the physical and institutional landscape of their city in ways that no single act of political will could undo. This is not admirable in any simple sense. A power structure that cannot be challenged is not obviously better than one that can. But it is extraordinarily effective, and in a world that has not yet developed the conceptual vocabulary to name what the Hightowers are doing, it is effectively invisible. Silence speaks in specific registers that we often underestimate. The Hightowers, across their long history, have been conspicuously absent from many of the most famous conflicts in Westerosi history. They were not at the Field of Fire. They were not present at Summerhall when the last Targaryen dragon died and the family's attempt to recapture something of its old power ended in flames. They did not join any of the 5 claimants in the War of the 5 Kings. They were not on the Blackwater. They were not at the Red Wedding. Their absence from these events is so consistent that it cannot be accidental. It is policy, and the policy is: do not commit yourself to a conflict whose outcome you cannot guarantee, whose victor may not remain the victor, whose battlefield will destroy resources that 12,000 years of patient accumulation have made irreplaceable. The Hightowers are not cowards. They are the most risk-aware family in the history of the realm. What their absence from the main conflicts of Westerosi history has protected is everything that makes them what they are. A Hightower army destroyed at the Field of Fire would have been a Hightower army that was no longer available to govern Oldtown, manage the harbour, support the Citadel, maintain the Starry Sept, and tend the fire at the top of the tower. A dead Hightower lord is a Hightower lord who is no longer available to make the quiet decisions that shape the next generation's understanding of the world. The family that bends its knee when the dragon comes and waits when the war begins is the family that is still there when the war is over, and the new king wants to know who governs the southern ports. The Hightowers will be available to answer that question. They will have been available to answer it every time it has been asked across 12,000 years. This is not strategy. It is character. The fire at the top of the Hightower has not gone out in the recorded history of the family. This is a claim that is difficult to verify across 12,000 years of weather and siege and accident, and the histories may be more poetic than precise on this point. But even if the fire has been briefly extinguished and quickly relit on some occasion that history chose not to record, the principle holds. The Hightowers have maintained their fire. They have kept the lights burning when other lights have gone out around them, when other families have been extinguished by conquest or catastrophe, or the simple biological failure of a line that produced no surviving heirs. The Hightowers endure. Their fire endures. And the city that grew up in the light of that fire endures alongside them, renewed generation by generation, still the largest and most complex settlement in the Western world, after 12,000 years of continuous occupation. Cersei Lannister, in her most exposed moments, understands something that she cannot quite articulate, that she's playing a game whose rules she does not entirely know, against opponents who have been playing it longer. Her power is real, but brittle. Her intelligence is genuine, but deployed in the service of goals that keep shifting as the political ground shifts beneath her. She's attempting to do, in real time, what the Hightowers have been doing across generations: accumulate power, insulate it against challenge, make herself necessary to the functioning of the system. But she's doing it without the one thing the Hightowers have always had: time. Time to build the institutions slowly enough that they feel organic rather than imposed. Time to establish the relationships that become so embedded in the fabric of daily life that removing them would require dismantling the fabric itself. Cersei has years. The Hightowers have millennia. That is not a difference of degree. It is a difference of kind. What the Hightower story teaches, if it teaches anything that can be carried out of the fantasy world and into the grey morning that waits on the other side of sleep, is something about the relationship between patience and permanence. We are accustomed to thinking of power as something won and then defended, seized through some decisive act and maintained through continued displays of strength. The Hightower model suggests something different, that the most permanent power is the kind that is never quite seized at all, that accumulates rather than conquering, that becomes indispensable gradually rather than imposing itself suddenly. This is not available to everyone. It requires a starting position and a particular kind of institutional support that most families and most individuals will never possess. But the underlying principle, that the things which endure are the things that make themselves necessary, is perhaps the oldest political lesson that this very old family has to offer. The Hightowers' method of soft power, accumulating influence through indispensability rather than through dominance, has a contemporary resonance that is worth sitting with gently rather than pressing too hard. In the world of the series, the families that survive are not always the families that are strongest or most aggressive. The families that survive are the ones that have managed to make themselves useful enough, connected enough, and embedded enough in the infrastructure of daily life that removing them would require dismantling things that everyone else depends on. This is not a comfortable truth, because it suggests that raw capability or virtue or even legitimate claim is less determinative of long-term survival than the particular kind of institutional embeddedness that the Hightowers have cultivated across 12,000 years. But it is the truth that the evidence of the story supports. The Night's Watch, the oldest military institution in Westeros, was founded to defend the realm and has been largely forgotten by it. The Citadel, which was founded to accumulate knowledge, has been woven into the fabric of every significant household in the realm. The difference in their fates is the difference between the Hightower method and everything else, and yet the Hightower story is not entirely a story of cold-blooded calculation and institutional manipulation. There is something in it that exceeds strategy, something in the sustained tending of a fire for 12,000 years, in the consistency of a beacon that has guided ships home in the dark across an incomprehensible span of time, that is not reducible to the logic of power. The Hightowers lit the way before there was a political system to benefit from lighting it. They tended a fire at the top of a structure they had not built, over a stone whose nature they could not explain, in service of a function, guiding sailors safely home, that gave them no particular advantage and cost them real resources across every generation. The power was a consequence of the service, not the other way around. And that suggests something about the Hightower story that is perhaps more interesting than the story of how they accumulated quiet influence. They accumulated it while doing something that was genuinely useful. The light was real before it was political, and it remains real, in the most literal possible sense tonight. The silence of the Hightowers is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of something so thoroughly present that it no longer needs to announce itself. The fire burns, the harbour is open, the maesters are in their castles, the records are in their stacks. The old stone at the base of the oldest tower sits in the earth and holds its mystery and keeps its own counsel about what it knows and what it does not. Let that silence settle over you now like the particular silence of a room where something very old and very important has been carefully tended for a very long time. There is nothing you need to add to it tonight. There is nothing you need to take from it. It is complete, the way patience that has achieved its purpose is complete. Breathe slowly. Rest in the long silence of a house that has never needed to shout. Your watch is ended, and so we arrive at the present. The war is happening. The dragons are flying. The others are gathering beyond the wall. The glass candles are burning. And in Oldtown, on the oldest foundation in the Western world, a young man named Sam has just discovered something in a library that may change the fate of everyone who is still alive. The Hightowers built the room he found it in. They lit the way that led him there, and the fire at the top of their tower is still burning. We have arrived at the end of a very long journey, 12,000 years of history, carried through 10 chapters of the night, and we are here now at the edge of the present, the place where the past connects to the story that you may already know, the story that has been unfolding in the books and the television series, and in the conversations that people all over the world have been having about this extraordinary invented history. Let your breathing slow now to the softest pace it has reached tonight. Let the weight of the journey settle into the surface beneath you. You have been a traveller through a very long time, and travellers who have come as far as you have tonight are allowed now to rest. The fire at the top of the Hightower is still burning. It has been burning all night. It will be burning in the morning, and in its light something important is visible, something that connects everything we have been following back to the characters you know. Samwell Tarly arrived in Oldtown carrying something that the Citadel was not prepared to receive: direct, first-hand knowledge of the enemy gathering beyond the wall. He had seen the White Walkers. He had killed another with dragonglass. He had been present at the destruction of a ranging party of the Night's Watch by a force that the South had been treating as legend. He arrived at the greatest repository of knowledge in the Western world, the institution that had been managing information for centuries, that had trained every Lord's administrator, that had maintained the Raven network, that had quietly shaped the intellectual assumptions of an entire civilization, and he told it what he knew. The institution heard him politely. It assigned him to cataloguing duties, and somewhere in the intersection of what he told them and what they already had in their stacks, the most important secret in Westeros was waiting to be found. The secret was a marriage, a private ceremony performed in Dorne in the years before Robert's rebellion, between Rhaegar Targaryen, the Crown Prince, Daenerys' older brother, the man who famously crowned Lyanna Stark with winter roses at a tourney, and Lyanna Stark herself. A secret marriage, performed before witnesses who included a maester. A marriage that had never been publicly acknowledged because the circumstances of its timing were catastrophic, because a war began before its implications could be managed. But a marriage nonetheless. A legal union between two of the most significant bloodlines in Westeros, and the child of that union, raised as Jon Snow, bastard of Eddard Stark in the cold of Winterfell, was not a bastard at all. He was Aegon Targaryen. He was the legitimate heir to the Iron Throne, senior in claim to Daenerys herself, and the evidence that established this was sitting, properly filed, in the archives of the Citadel in Oldtown. It is worth pausing here at this final turning point and feeling the full weight of what that means for the story of House Hightower. The truth about Jon Snow's identity, the truth that may determine the outcome of everything, was stored in an institution in Oldtown, in the Hightowers city, in the knowledge network that the Hightowers' 12,000-year presence had made possible and maintained. The Hightowers did not arrange for this truth to be there. They did not plan for Sam to arrive and find it. They did not engineer the marriage or commission the Maester's diary that would one day prove it. They simply built the place where all truths eventually come to rest. They lit the way as they had always lit the way. And the truth navigated by their light, the way ships navigate by the beacon, not knowing who lit it or why, but finding the harbour nonetheless. Simultaneously with Sam's presence in Oldtown, the glass candle in the Citadel has begun to burn. Elsewhere in the world, Daenerys Targaryen's 3 dragons have been born. Beyond the wall, the others are moving south in numbers that have not been seen since the Long Night, 8,000 years before the main series, the event that built the wall, that established the Night's Watch, that is the oldest and deepest trauma in the memory of the North. The world is changing. The conditions that suppressed magic for centuries are relaxing. The things that the Citadel's rational curriculum had taught were impossible are beginning, one by one, to become possible again. Whatever Lord Leighton Hightower and his daughter Melora are doing at the top of their tower, whatever they are preparing for, whatever understanding they are assembling from ancient books and older stones and the particular resonance of the black foundation beneath them, the world outside is moving in their direction. The fire at the top of the high tower is both a literal flame and a metaphor that the series seems to offer without quite declaring. It burns in white as its default state, the colour of neutrality, of illumination without declaration, of light that serves everyone equally and asks nothing in return. It has burned through the Andal invasion and the Targaryen conquest and the Dance of Dragons and the collapse of the Targaryen dynasty and the reign of Robert Baratheon and the chaos of the War of the Five Kings. It has not been extinguished by any of these things. It will, one imagines, not be extinguished by whatever is coming next. The flame is the answer to the question that runs through the entire Hightower story. What endures? Not armies, not crowns, not the alliances that seemed permanent and the powers that seemed unassailable. The flame endures, and the family that tends it endures alongside it, outlasting everything it illuminates. The Hightower at night, seen from a ship approaching Oldtown from the sea, must look something like the world's most confident gesture. Not a declaration. Declarations can be denied. Not a threat. Threats can be refused. A gesture that is simply there, simply upward, simply burning in the dark that surrounds it. The city below is warm with its 1,000 individual lights, the fires in the hearths, and the torches in the streets, and the lanterns in the harbour, all of them small and particular, and belonging to individual lives being lived, and above all of them, the beacon, fixed, white, patient, drawing a line between the dark water and the sky, between the dangerous and the safe, between not knowing where you are and knowing exactly where the harbour is. That line has been drawn from this place for 12,000 years. That is the oldest continuous act of generosity in the history of the Western world, and it has no author that anyone living can name. In the taxonomy of great houses that the main series builds with such care, the Starks who endure, the Lannisters who contend, the Targaryens who burn and are reborn, House Hightower occupies a category that none of those words quite captures. They are not endurance in the Stark sense, which is endurance through suffering and resistance, and the grim maintenance of honour in the face of catastrophe. They are not contention in the Lannister sense, which is contention through ambition and intelligence, and a constant high-stakes engagement with the political life of the realm. They are something more ambient than either of those. They are the condition that makes other things possible. They are the infrastructure that everyone else builds on, the light that everyone else navigates by, the knowledge that everyone else draws on. They are the family that has understood, for longer than any other family alive, that the most permanent power is the power of the necessary. When Daenerys Targaryen's dragons fly above Westeros for the first time, when the continent that has been dragonless for a century and a half sees fire in the sky again. The world that those dragons are flying over is a world that the Hightowers have shaped in ways that are invisible precisely because they are structural. The Maesters who advised the lords who will have to choose their response to the dragons were trained in Oldtown. The legal and historical frameworks within which the question of Targaryen legitimacy will be debated were established and maintained in Oldtown. The records that prove that the young man riding north on a borrowed horse is actually the most legitimate claimant to the throne are sitting in Oldtown. The Hightowers lit the way, as they have always lit the way, for something they could not have anticipated from 12,000 years away, and the light they lit still finds the ships it needs to find. Sam's time in Oldtown is brief in the scope of the series, but its implications are long. He arrives carrying knowledge that the Citadel resists and leaves carrying knowledge that the world needs, specifically the confirmation, drawn from a Maester's diary describing the secret marriage ceremony in Dawn, that Jon Snow is Aegon Targaryen, the legitimate son of Rhaegar and Lyanna. This information, when it finally reaches the people who need it, changes the terms of everything that follows. It changes Daenerys' understanding of what she is fighting for, and with whom she is sharing the fighting. It changes Jon's own understanding of who he is, which is perhaps the most significant personal transformation in the series, the revelation that the man who has been defined by his illegitimacy is in fact more legitimately royal than almost anyone alive. And this transformation, this revelation, this truth that has been waiting patiently in an archive in Oldtown, it passed through the Hightower's shadow to reach the people it needed to reach. The Hightowers did not arrange this. They simply built the place where truths are kept and kept the light burning above it. There is something that needs to be said about the Hightower words one final time, because we light the way is not merely a motto. It is a description of a philosophy that has been practiced without interruption for longer than almost any human institution has existed. Lighting the way does not mean knowing where the destination is. The lighthouse does not know where each ship is going. It simply provides a fixed reference point from which navigation is possible, a thing that is reliably there, reliably visible, reliably useful, regardless of the ship's destination. The Hightowers have been this for Westeros across 12,000 years. They did not know that the archive they maintained would one day contain the proof of a legitimate Targaryen heir. They did not know that the institution they patronized would one day receive a young man from the Night's Watch carrying knowledge about the return of the dead. They did not know that the black stone at the base of their tower would one day become relevant to the understanding of a supernatural threat gathering in the north. They simply kept the light burning. They simply maintained the archive. They simply kept the harbour open, and the ships that needed those things found them. What remains at the end of 12,000 years is the same thing that was there at the beginning. The fire, the stone, the water, and the patience to tend all of them across a span of time that no individual human life can contain. The great houses of Westeros measure their histories in centuries. The Targaryens with their dragons held the continent for roughly 300 years before the rebellion that ended them. The Starks go back 8,000 years to the construction of Winterfell, and they are among the oldest houses in the realm. The Hightowers have been in their tower for 12,000 years, and the tower itself predates them by an era that no one can calculate. Whatever comes next in the world of ice and fire and dragon and other, whatever resolution the great conflict of the series arrives at, the Hightower will still be there when the resolution settles. It has been there through worse. It will be there through this. The black stone at its base has no opinion about the current crisis. The fire at its top simply burns, and so we come, at last, to rest. The Hightower is still standing. The beacon is still burning. The black stone at its base is still holding its secret about what it is and who made it, and what it was for, and it will hold that secret as long as the world chooses to let it. Sam is sleeping somewhere in the Citadel, exhausted from a day of cataloguing books that contain more than he has yet had time to read. Jon Snow is riding through the dark toward a destiny he does not yet know the shape of. Daenerys is on a ship somewhere on the open water, moving toward a continent that she has never seen and that has been waiting for her in its own way. The glass candle is burning in a room that no one is in, and above Oldtown, above the harbour, above the city that has been the world's oldest continuously inhabited place for longer than anyone can fully imagine, the fire burns steady and white and patient and true. Let your own light dim now. Let the weight of the history you have travelled through tonight settle quietly around you. There is nothing you need to carry forward into sleep. The tower is lit. The way is clear. The stories will keep, all of them, until morning. And now, and finally, your watch is ended. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.